This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so now continuing with intestinal obstruction, part 3, the remaining cause of intestinal obstruction we'll be covering in this lecture. And starting with the disclosures about the pictures from the net and on the chapters. Now coming to the special types of mechanical obstructions, we have been already talking about mechanical obstructions in the last 2 lectures. This time we'll be talking about some special types of mechanical obstruction, and first of them is the internal hernias. Not a very common occurrence. If you look, this occurs in 1% of the population and is responsible for about 5 to 6% of all small bowel obstructions. That's about 1/10 of the, or let's say 1/20th of all the obstructions, small bowel obstructions, are probably because of internal hernias. And you can define the internal hernia as the protrusion of the bowel through a congenital or acquired defect in the peritoneal lining. Just like it is a protrusion through one of the defects in the abdominal wall or elsewhere in the first containing layer for the external hernia. So here also it has to be in the peritoneal lining. It should be an acquired defect in the lining. Only then you'll have an internal hernia. The types could be many, just an enumeration of the various types starting from diaphragm downwards. You can have the diaphragmatic, slightly lower down you go to the foramen of Winslow, then you come to the duodenum and the fossas around the duodenum, then you come to the mesentery, mostly post-operative. You can have it through the omentum, you can have it in the pericecal region, go to the left lower down, the sigmoid, further lower down the pelvic floor, and of course further lower down the internal supravesical hernias, plus multiple variations of each one of them. Let's talk about the pericecal hernia, the hernias around the cecum. This is a figure which shows you the cecum out here, the ileum here, the appendix. Now when you lift the cecum up, you would have a cecal fossa below. You'll have a cecal fold extending from the parietal peritoneum onto the posterolateral surface of the cecum. This is the posterolateral surface of the cecum. So that is the fold out there. You have a mesenterico-parietal fold from the mesentery of the ileum down into the parietal peritoneum. And then you've got the folds in between the ileum and the cecum. So you have the superior ileocecal, the inferior ileocecal, two folds from the ileum to the cecum, the superior, and this is the inferior ileocecal. We'll show you a further picture in one of the later slides. And then you got the retrocecal and the paracolic sulci, the size where you can have the pericecal hernias. Coming to the first one of them, and that is the cecal fossa. As said earlier, the cecal fossa can be defined by the two folds. So you have the cecal fold, or you have the mesenterico-parietal fold on the medial. This is the lateral. Behind you've got the parietal peritoneum, and here you got the posterior surface of cecum. So this is basically a cecal fossa. It can either be a shallow depression or it may be large enough to admit an index finger. In those cases, the likelihood of having an internal hernia is much more. So it's extending upwards behind the ascending colon. So what comes distal to the cecum? The ascending colon. So it is extending behind the ascending colon, okay, in the direction of the kidney. Kidney is somewhere here upstairs. So bounded by cecal fold, mesenterico-parietal fold, the parietal peritoneum, above by the kidney, and in some instances you can have a fossa behind this, that is the retrocecal fossa, right? So that is the first site around the cecum where you can have the hernia. The second and third are the ileocecal fold. So first let's come to the superior ileocecal fossa. So this, if you see this fold, a very clear cut fold, you got the mesentery of the ileum, and you've got the medial boundary of the cecum. There's the cecum, you got the appendix, and you got the mesoappendix. So this is basically a fold which is containing, this is the anterior ileocecal artery. See the anterior ileocecal artery? So that is lying in the free edge of the superior ileocecal fold, and this is the fossa in between the ileum and the superior ileocecal fold. So it's a narrow chink. Posteriorly, the mesentery of the ileum and the small portion of the cecum behind it. So this is lying posterior, that's the posterior part, and this is basically the anterior part. That is the superior ileocecal fossa. Similarly, you've got the inferior ileocecal fossa. Now, this is again formed by the ileocecal fold of peritoneum, also known as the bloodless fold of Treves. It is situated behind the ileocecal junction. So this is the ileocecal, the inferior ileocecal fossa and the inferior ileocecal fold. See, this is the fold. So it's extending from the mesentery of the appendix. The superior was extending between the cecum and the ileal mesentery. This is extending between the ileum and the mesentery of the appendix. So that the Blunt's fold of Treves, very commonly identified whenever you're doing a appendectomy. Again, it could be a narrow chink or it could be deep down. So basically, if you have any entrapment in this particular fossa, it would be an inferior ileocecal fossa hernia. Now coming to the more important, these are the paraduodenal hernias, also known as the Treves hernias. Now the paraduodenal hernias are roughly 4 in number. Let's first talk about the inferior and the superior duodenal fossa. Now this is the inferior duodenal fossa. This is the duodenum. So the duodenum is coming from here, just to make the orientation clear to you. So stomach is somewhere here. This is transmesocolon. Stomach is somewhere here. Coming from here, then you have the duodenum, and from the duodenum, the first part, the second part, the third. This is the third part ascending, and then you've got the fourth part of the duodenum, right? So this is the ascending part of the duodenum, and then comes the duodenojejunum. Now the jejunum has been turned to the right. You have just shifted it to the right side. So normally jejunum should be lying somewhere here, but we have shifted to the right. So when you do that, you are exposing two fossas out here, the superior and the inferior duodenal fossa. Let's talk about the inferior duodenal fossa. So if we look at the site, it is roughly opposite the third lumbar vertebrae on the left side, right? That is the ascending portion of the duodenum, or the fourth part, after which it goes and forms the DJ junction. This opening is always directed upwards. See, it is directed upwards, and the fossa is directed downwards. So you have the fossa going in, and you have the opening directed upward. Now it's bounded by a thin sharp fold of peritoneum. See this sharp fold of peritoneum? This is a concave margin. That's a concave margin. If it had been like this is a convex margin. This is a concave margin called the duodeno-mesenteric fold. So this is the duodeno-mesenteric fold that we are looking at. Duodenum and mesentery, right? Which mesentery are we talking about? We're talking about the mesentery of the transverse colon out here, right? The tip of the index finger introduces the fossa under the fold, passes some little distance behind the duodenum. So that is where it is going, right? So that is the important part about this fossa, that it is always directed upwards, opening upwards, and it is proceeding downwards, right? Now coming to the superior duodenal fossa. If we look at the superior duodenal fossa, as opposed to the inferior duodenal, which is usually identified in 3/4 of the laparotomies that you open up, 3/4 of the patient, 3/4 of the patient would be having a inferior duodenal fossa. Looking at the superior duodenal fossa, is present in almost half the patient, 40 to 50% occurrence, and it often coexists with the inferior one. See, you got both of them out here, although this is a diagrammatic view, agreed. So you got the inferior and the superior. Now this is opposite L3, this is opposite L2 vertebrae. Again, lies on the left of the ascending portion of the duodenum. So this is the ascending portion of the duodenum. That was also on the left. This is also on the left. The L2, L3. So these things are common. Okay. Now this would be a sickle-shaped concave downwards or convex upwards fold known as the duodenojejunal fold. Why? Because this is now extending between the duodenum and the jejunum, as opposed to the lower one, which was basically a duodenum and the transverse colon, the mesentery of the descending colon. So duodeno-mesenteric fold. That was the first one. See this? That's the duodeno-mesocolic. That's why it's known as mesocolic. Colic means descending colon. And as opposed to that, this is basically a duodenojejunal fold. Okay. Now, what is important with this fold is that you have a vessel coming out here, which will be more important in the third fossa that we'll be looking at. So in both these cases, both these are about 1 to 2 centimeters. Both of them are closely related to the ascending portion of the duodenum lying on the left. One is at L2, other is L3. Both of them are not very deep, and both of them would be having free folds of mesentery, which is forming the opening. Okay, now coming to the more important, and that is the left paraduodenal fossa, also known as the duodenojejunal fossa or fossa of Lanzert. Now, why is this important? This is important for the simple reason that it is closely related to some vessel. Let's see what the vessel is. First, let's see what it is. Now, this is in even lesser cases. Remember, the first one, the inferior, was present in 75% cases, the superior in almost 40-50% cases, and this is half of that, exists in 15 to 20% of all cases and 2% of all autopsy cases, right? It is usually not present along with the other paraduodenal fossa. So superior and inferior are usually coexistent, maybe coexistent, but here this is usually not found in conjunction with other forms of duodenal fossa. And it can be seen by pulling the jejunum downward and to the right. So I'm pulling the jejunum downward to the right, and that exposes this fold of mesentery. Now this is basically above, you have the pancreas somewhere here, right side the aorta somewhere here, left side the kidney somewhere here, and beneath you got the renal vein. Now the important point is when you have this left paraduodenal fossa, the anterior femoral fold, the duodenal-mesocolic fold, that has got two important vessels in it, and that is the inferior mesenteric vein, and you got the ascending branch of the left colic artery. Why is it important? Because if you want to open this up and you want to expose or you want to release the obstruction, you're going to cut on this mesenteric fold. Now, when you're cutting on the mesenteric fold, the free fold of the mesentery is having these two vessels. And if you're not careful and you cut, what is going to happen? You're either going to cut the left colic artery along with the free fold, or you're going to cut the inferior mesenteric vein. And that is the important point that has to be remembered whenever you're trying to relieve an obstruction in the left paraduodenal fossa. The depth is again same, about 2 to 3 centimeters, as in other paraduodenal fossa, nearly circular. Admit the tip of a little index finger, right? And the orifice, see this arrow? It is going to the left and downwards. That is where it is going. So from the opening, the fossa is going downwards, right? And if you have to release the obstruction, then you have to prevent injury to the vessels, especially the inferior mesenteric vein, and to the ascending branch of the colic artery. This is a picture, an operative picture that we operated. Can you see this fossa? A very clear fossa, opening of the fossa seen here. That is the DJ. So we have pulled the jejunum up. We have pulled it up. When you pull it up, you find this fossa going downward. That is the fossa, right? Now, if you look at the free fold, now we are inside, the finger is inside the fossa, and I'm holding the free edge of the fold. And what do I find? I find the inferior mesenteric vein. See the inferior mesenteric vein? The inferior. So if I am going to cut like this, what's going to happen? I'm going to cut the vein. So where should I cut? I should cut here. If I want to relieve the obstruction, I should cut here so that I don't injure the inferior mesenteric vein. So that is why it is important to know where we are going. And the fourth fossa that we have to remember is the right paraduodenal. So you got the superior, the inferior, the left paraduodenal, and the right paraduodenal. Very, very simple. If you look at the right paraduodenal, it is found also known as fossa of Waldeyer, a fossa of Kolb, or mesenterico-parietal fossa. It is found even less commonly, only in about 1% autopsy cases, and the most usual position of this fossa is the first part of the mesojejunum. See this jejunum? That's the jejunum, right? And you pull the jejunum to the, you reflected it to the right. When you reflect it to the right, then you find under the mesentery, you'll find this opening of the fossa. So immediately behind the superior mesenteric artery. Now, what is important about this? Now, as opposed to the left paraduodenal, where you have the inferior mesenteric vein and the ascending branch of the left colic, here you have got the whole superior mesenteric artery lying in the free fold. And if by chance, if you're not able to reduce, say this patient has got a strangulated internal hernia in the right paraduodenal fossa, and you want to release this constriction ring. Now what do? In gay abandon, you cut. You cut here. What's going to happen? You cut the superior mesenteric artery. What's going to happen? Gangrene of the whole small bowel and part of the large bowel. So remember, you can't do that. So it's very, very important to understand that the free fold of the mesentery forming the anterior boundary of the opening of the fossa houses the superior mesenteric artery, right? And that is why it is very, very important. It also has a branch of the right colic artery. So there also in the left paraduodenal, you had a vein and an artery. What was the vein? Inferior mesenteric vein. What was the artery? The ascending branch, the left colic artery. On the right side, the paraduodenal again has got a vessel that is mesenteric. And which artery are we talking about? The artery that we're talking about is the right colic artery, right? The fossa, it is going to the right. See this fossa? It is going to the right. Can you see this mesenteric artery out here? That is the fold, and the jejunum is entering into the right paraduodenal, and it is proceeding downwards and to the right. So the direction of the fossa is downwards and to the right, and the opening is upwards and to the left. So entrapment of the bowel can occur in this, and you have to be very, very careful if you want to cut on the free edge of the restriction. Coming to the third, and that is the intersigmoid fossa. So we talked about the paracecal, we talked about the paraduodenal, and now about the intersigmoid fossa, and that is basically lying on the lateral side of the sigmoid mesentery, constant in the fetus and infancy, but disappears with the passage of age. It can only remain in few percent in the older age group. And what do you have as a content? You have the ureter line just beneath on the left surface of the sigmoid vesicolum. So left surface basically means what? In between the sigmoid and the abdominal wall. That is the left of the sigmoid. So lies on the external iliac vessels in the interspace between the psoas muscle. So here somewhere would be the psoas muscle and the iliacus muscle, and you have the iliac vein and the iliac artery running like this, and you have the ureter crossing them, right? It varies in size, not a very important fossa because more or less it is more like a dimple. Very rarely that's going to admit a large finger. Now, recent times with the advent of bariatric or metabolic surgery, more and more people are doing it. More and more people are getting it done. More and more patients are getting it done. So we have to understand what the post-bariatric internal hernias are. There are three important hernias in the post-bariatric region, and that is one. I am not very sure if you understand what procedure done, but just look at this figure. One of the procedure done is what is known as the Roux-en-Y anastomosis after you have transected the stomach. See, the stomach is only this much. That is a stomach pouch remaining. Can you visualize this? You appreciate this? This is the small part of the stomach. And this is the jejunum, which has been dragged through the transverse mesocolon, that's the mesocolon, dragged up into the supracholic compartment. So when you drag this up, you're going to create an opening in the mesocolon. If you leave this opening as such, another part of the bowel can herniate through this. So the first site, the first defect in a post-bariatric patient is the defect in the transverse mesocolon. So the gold standard of bariatric surgery as of today is the Roux-en-Y, what is shown, what is depicted in this picture. The second site of hernia is where you're doing a jejunojejunostomy. A jejunojejunostomy. Can you see the cut of jejunum and the loop? So where if you're not careful enough to fix this opening underneath the mesentery of the jejunum, then you can have what is known as the hernia at the jejunojejunal side, that is the C. So transmesocolon jejunojejunostomy hernia. The third is what is known as the Peterson's hernia, which could be retrocolic or anticolic Peterson's type. And what is that? When you're dragging this whole jejunum up, along with it, the mesentery goes in. But that mesentery and between this mesentery, you have an opening on the right side. So this is basically behind the Roux-en-Y limb. So this is the Roux-en-Y limb. It's lying behind the Roux-en-Y limb mesentery and the transverse mesocolon. So this is known as the Peterson's hernia. So you should remember three typical hernias, three typical internal hernias, not very uncommon, not very common either, but they are not uncommon, so you have to remember them. Most common is the transverse mesocolon, second is jejunojejunostomy site hernia, and third is behind the ascending limb of the Roux-en-Y, what is known as the Peterson's hernia. So three hernias when you talk about post-bariatric internal hernia. Now coming to the second type, so these were the internal hernias. Now coming to the second important type of obstruction, that is acute neonatal obstruction. I'll just be touching on a few of them, not the whole, but just you have to remember that a neonatal obstruction can be diagnosed prenatally. That is one very important point to be appreciated and to be known. So prenatal, how can you diagnose? That means when the fetus is inside the body, you can diagnose that this fetus is probably having an obstruction. How do you know that? A prenatal ultrasound or a fetal MRI during the third semester. Remember, so that is the time when you're targeting the fetus. The third semester is time you're targeting the fetus and you're trying to look for an obstruction in the small bowel. What are the indications we should do that? We'll just come to that. So what are the indicators that the patient really has obstruction? Number one, you can find a double bubble sign. What is that? That is basically found due to atresia. You can have a dilated bowel. If you the reason has to be ascertained. Why should the fetus be having a dilated bowel? The bowel should be normal inside. Or the patient is having a polyhydramnios. Now, the degree of polyhydramnios is directly proportional to more proximal atresia. Basically, meaning the more proximal the atresia or obstruction, the more the polyhydramnios. So it accompanies duodenal atresia in 53%. But if you go for the more distal blocks, that the jejunum and ileum, it becomes less, found in 25% of cases. It has got simple explanation, and that is more of absorption in the distal epithelium will lead to less polyhydramnios, and less absorption in the distal epithelium will lead to more of polyhydramnios. So if intestine is absorbing less, more polyhydramnios; intestine is absorbing more, less polyhydramnios. And when would the absorption be more? When the block is more distal. When is that? When the patient has a jejuno-ileal atresia. Is that clear? Right? So once you have these indicators, a complete prenatal evaluation has to be done. And in addition to that, an amniocentesis should always be done in all those patients where the mother is carrying a fetus with a probable bowel atresia, especially small bowel atresia. Why is it required? Because a bowel atresia is often associated with a whole list of other coexistent conditions, namely cystic fibrosis of the pancreas, trisomy 21 Down syndrome, congenital heart diseases, bowel rotational abnormalities, annular pancreas, esophageal atresia, ARMs, and genitourinary conditions. So all of them could be associated. So you have to really working on a fetus, trying to ascertain what's wrong with the fetus. Then you should do all these things and try to look for what is wrong in that particular fetus. The postnatal diagnosis is fairly easy. Prenatal is difficult, postnatal is fairly easy, and you have to take help of number one, a place diagram of the abdomen in the AP view. What are you looking for? You're looking for a double bubble sign or duodenal atresia. I'll show you in one of the figures later on, one of the slide later on. Are you looking for a small bowel obstruction? Those dilated bowel loops on small bowel obstruction, typical of what we already discussed in small bowel obstruction, the latter pattern type of Volvic conventous arrangement in distended bowel, more than 3 centimeters. Remember, we talked about small bowel obstruction. All these things are there. Or you can do a contrast upper GI study using which contrast? Gastrographin. Or you can do a contrast enema. Why do you want to do a contrast enema? For the simple reason that you want to differentiate it from a colonic condition. You really have a small bowel or colonic, then you have to do a colonic enema. You can do a CT scan, and you can do a rectal biopsy indicated in those patients where you probably have a Hirschsprung disease or other disorders of transference of neurogenic impulses. Now, when you look at acute neonatal obstruction, so this was how you diagnose it prenatally and postnatally, just a short coverage. I'm not going to go into the details, that's beyond your scope. Then acute neonatal obstruction, the important condition that you usually look for. Number one, the congenital atresia and stenosis, the most common. Among these two, 95% are atresias and stenosis 5%. So we're looking at atresia of the bowel and stenosis of the bowel. 95% are going to be atresia, that means maldevelopment, and 5% only narrowing of the bowel. Intestinal malrotation, midgut volvulus, we already talked about that. We talked about small bowel volvulus, we already covered that. Meconium ileus, Hirschsprung disease, ARM, necrotizing enterocolitis, incarcerated inguinal hernias. We'll be covering these two in bold, congenital atresia and meconium ileus. The rest of them would be dealt with in their specific chapters. Right? Coming to atresia and stenosis, the sites, it can start anywhere from proximal bowel to the distal bowel, namely pylorus, it could be pyloric atresia. Rarest type of congenital intestinal obstruction, only 1 in 1 million live births. 1 million is 10 lakhs. So 1 in 1 million live births. Duodenal is more common, approximately 1 in 6,000 to 1 in 10,000 live births. That is very, very common when you compare it with pyloric atresia. It's very common. In 6,000 births, you have 1 duodenal, or 10,000 births, you have 1 duodenal atresia. Most common congenital small bowel obstruction diagnosed prenatally. So that is again a very good condition for prenatal diagnosis. Not that it is a very good condition to have, but it can be diagnosed fairly conclusively prenatally. So it is the most commonly diagnosed prenatal condition. Jejuno-ileal atresia, most common type of neonatal obstruction. And as compared to duodenal, see, this occurs in 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 3,000. So this was 1 in 10 lakhs or 1 million. This was 1 in 6,000 to 1 in 10,000. And this is 10 times more common. That is 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 3,000 live births. The rarest of them is the colonic. Now, coming to the pathophysiology of these atresias. Now, if you look at the pathophysiology of atresias, the two most common ones are the duodenal and the jejunal-ileal. They have got distinct pathophysiology. Distinct. You have to understand that. A duodenal atresia is failure of recanalization. Now, whenever the intestinal tube is formed, you know the basic progress. Initially, it is a solid cord-like, then recanalizes, right? And then again, it undergoes complete obliteration and then recanalization. So initially, when it is a solid cord-like and recanalization, final recanalization has to occur, which normally occurs at the 8th through 10th weeks of gestation after obliteration lumen by epithelial proliferation at 6 to 7 weeks. So what has happened? Initially lumen, then epithelial proliferation occurs 6-7 weeks, gets obliterated, and then recanalizations. That's what we use, recanalization. That means it is now being canalized for the second time. So if the recanalization doesn't occur, then it is usually the cause for duodenal atresia. So duodenal atresia is a failure of recanalization of the intestinal tube, which was destined to occur at 8 to 10 weeks gestation, right? Usually occurs in the second part of the duodenum, that is the distal second part of the duodenum, that is the lower second part of the duodenum. And what is the distal second part of the duodenum? Why are we specifying distal? Because it is distal to the ampulla of Vater, that is the most common type. That is very important. You have to remember that the position of the ampulla in relation to the atresia is very, very important. So whether it's lying distal to the atresia, lying proximal to the atresia. So most commonly, the ampulla of the Vater is lying in the distended part, that means proximal to the atresia. Incomplete recanalization can lead to duodenal stenosis or presence of a duodenal web. So if it has partially recanalized, you can have a web. It is totally recanalized, no problem. It is absolutely not recanalized, then you got the atresias. Okay. Now let's look at the pathophysiology of jejunal atresia. What is different? Now this basically occurs after normal intestinal development, which means what? That lumen was there, epithelial proliferation obliterated the lumen. Then what happened? Recanalization was complete, no problem. So then what is jejunal atresia all about? It is basically about an ischemic injury to the gut, usually secondary to why should an ischemic injury occur in a fetus? Malrotation with volvulus, intestinal strangulation at the umbilical ring, intestinal perforation, or if the vasoconstrictive drugs have been used in the mother. So what we are looking at is one distinct condition, which is really a maldevelopment, embryological maldevelopment. The other is an insult in the fetus. That means intrauterine fetal insult. Is that clear? So jejunal atresia is an ischemic injury. Duodenal atresia is a developmental anomaly. That should be absolutely clear. Looking at duodenal atresia now specifically, just a few words about duodenal atresia. We said 1 in 6,000 to 1 in 10,000 live births, agreed. 53% polyhydramnios, we already specified that. Prenatal third semester, dilated stomach, most common condition to be diagnosed, we already specified that. 7 to 33% have got heart disease, we didn't specify that. Now you know that 1/3 of them or 1/5 of them would be having an associated congenital heart disease, CHDs. And 30% would be having Down syndrome or trisomy of 21, chromosome 21. Right? Now, what are the types of duodenal atresia? 4 types: type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4. Now, just concentrate on the opening, that is the ampulla. See, the ampulla in most of them is lying proximal to the obstruction. The obstruction here, 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 here. Now, type 1 is basically when you have a web which can either be fenestrated in the middle or at the side. That means what you're looking at is not a complete obstruction, it is a slightly incomplete obstruction because of luminal webs or membranes with a possible central defect of fenestration of variable size in a few of them, right? Now, results in what? Results in a marked discrepancy with mural continuity. So the muscle is continuous, nothing wrong with the muscle. Muscle is continuous, but there is a web which is obstructing the lumen. which may be fenestrated, either solitary, multiple fenestration, but the web is there. Now, there are instances. Now, if you see this figure carefully, see the red mark, the web is going high up. Can you see this? And here the web is sticking only to this place. Now, when you have this kind of a variant, this is known as a windsock variant, where the origin of the membrane is several centimeters proximal to the apex of the web. So this is the apex of the web. The web is arising, the membrane arising from here. So several centimeters proximal to the apex of the web that arises, and that is what is known as the windsock variant of the duodenal web or type 1 duodenal atresia. Is that clear? Now we come to type 2 atresia, and here the mural continuity which was there. See, the muscle was continuous here. Muscle continuous. Here the muscle is not continuous. Instead, what do you have? You have a fibrous cord. So type 2 is a fibrous cord connecting the proximal dilated and the distal collapsed duodenum. Right? Now, in type 3, even this cord is missing. So you have discontinuous. There is no continuity between the distal collapsed limb and the proximal dilated limb. It is one of the rarest types of duodenal atresia. Now, I already specified that the site of ampulla is very important, and predominance of post-ampullary obstruction. That means in 85% of cases, the ampulla is lying proximal to the obstruction, 85%. It's only in 15% patients that of fetus or the infant where you have this ampulla lying distal. So if you have the ampulla say here, then that would be distal to the block, right? But 85%, the figure would be something like this. The other thing that you have to remember is that because this part undergoes dilatation, and depending upon the hugener of dilatation and stretching of the wall, diameter of the wall, it usually outstrips its blood supply. So in most of these cases, this part of the duodenum becomes aperistaltic, questionable viability because of ischemia or decreased amount of blood supply, or both. So you have to be very, very careful when you're trying to utilize this dilated duodenum for any kind of reconstruction. This is what is known as the double bubble sign, which you have been referring to regularly. See the bubble number 1, bubble number 2. What is this bubble? This is basically the gas collected in the duodenal bulb. That is the first and the proximal second part of the duodenum, right? That is the duodenal bulb. So it is the first part of the duodenum and going into the second part, that is the duodenal bulb. So here there is a collection. Why should there be air trapped here? Because the obstruction is somewhere here. This is the first part, second part, third part, and fourth part of the duodenum. That's how it would be arranged. So one gas bubble here, one here. That is known as the double bubble sign, seen on a plain skygram. It will also be seen on a gastrograph in contrast study. It will also be seen on a plain ultrasound examination, and on endoscopy, you will find when you enter into the duodenum, it would be as if you're entering into a cave, a hugely dilated duodenum. How do you treat it? Simple. Do not do a gastrojejunostomy. Underline it. The immediate impulse would be, let me anastomose the hugely dilated duodenum with a jejunum, or the stomach with a jejunum. Do a gastrojejunostomy. Easy way out. But you are forgetting one thing. Remember, where is the ampulla line? In this dilated part. So ampulla is somewhere here. Where will the biliary secretions go? Excretion, biliary pancreatic will go to the duodenum, and from here into the stomach, leading to what? Biliary gastritis. That means going to irritate the gastric epithelium for you. This patient will be having terrible bouts of vomiting. So gastrojejunostomy is no answer to duodenal atresias. Please underline that. The only answer is you have to do a duodenostomy. That means the collapsed part of the duodenum and the dilated part of the duodenum. Either you do a transverse anastomosis, you make a transverse cut out here and here, or this part can be cut vertically, and we are going to cut this vertically. C, D has to be approximately D, B to B, A to A, C to C. So here you have already done A to A, C to C, and B to B. So this now looks like a diamond. D would be taken up and hitched up. So this is also known as a diamond anastomosis. So the anastomosis is done in two ways. One is a transverse side to side. Both of them are transverse. In the other, it is a diamond anastomosis. The proximal cut is transverse. There's a proximal cut transverse. the distal cut is longitudinal. Along with that, always divide the lattice band, which we referred to last time, which is stretching from the parietal peritoneum across the duodenum in the malrotated into the ascending colon. So that is the lattice band for you. So you have to divide that. If you're doing a duodenal atresia, you find lattice band is there, you also have to divide that. Coming to the most common atresias, and the jejunal-ileal atresia and stenosis. Most common, why? Because 1 in 3,000 live births, 25% have got polyhydramnios. Remember I told you, the more distal the block, the less polyhydramnios. Number 3, vascular disruption is very common. 10% cerebral cystic fibrosis. Now, common clinical characteristics of patients include the following. Number 1, polyhydramnios. We already said that. Prematurity. These children are usually premature. Low birth weight is also found in almost 50% of them. That means 1/3 would be premature, and almost one-fourth to one-half would be having a low birth weight. These are the types of atresias, type 1, 2, and 3. So type 1, basically mucosal atresia with intact bowel dysentery. So here see mural continuity. Just like in duodenal atresia type 1, mural continuity is there. The continuity is there, but there would be mucosal atresia. Okay, that is type 1. Stenosis is not classified as a type of atresia, so that has been kept separately. Type 2, similar to duodenal atresia, cord. Here also it's a cord, fibrous cord connecting the two parts, the collapsed and the dilated. Duodenal atresia, again, collapsed and dilated part. So here also it is a fibrous cord. Type 3 are 2, type 3A and 3B. In both the conditions, the two ends are separate. Remember, in duodenal atresia type 3, what was there? Two ends were separated. Here also separated. But here the separation is in two forms. In 3A, you have got a V-shaped defect in the mesentery, right? As a V defect. That is 3A. 3B is what is known as the apple peel or Christmas tree. And here what is happening is, this is the proximal, this is the distal. Now, this distal segment has coiled around the superior mesenteric artery pedicle, giving it an apple peel. When you peel the apple, you peel it something like this. Use a peeler to peel the apple, and it comes out in concentric rings. So this is the apple peel of Christmas tree coiled around the superior mesenteric artery pedicle or superior mesenteric vessels pedicle, and that is type 3B. Type 4 is there are multiple segments of atresia. So atretic segment here, so giving rise dilated here. One more atresia here, again dilated. One more atresia, again dilated. So you have multiple atresia and multiple dilatations. These multiple dilated segments appear like sausages. So it is known as a string of sausage appearance, right? String of sausage appearance. Now, the classical signs usually arise within 24 to 48 hours of birth. That is how it clearly presents. In a duodenal atresia, it's going to present with bilious vomiting immediately after birth. Here, the classical signs are going to appear slightly later, 24 to 48 hours after birth, in the first 2 days of life. And what else happens in this patient? What are the classical signs? Number 1, failure to pass meconium in the first 24 hours. There are instances where there could be a very narrow opening and some meconium may be passed, but that's not without reason. But more commonly, failure to pass meconium. Number 2, biliary vomitings, emesis, abdominal distension and distal atresia. The more distal the atresia, the more the distension. Simple. If you have a general atresia, what's going to dilate? Only the stomach. If you have a ileal atresia, what's going to dilate? The jejunum and the stomach. So obviously, the distension is going to be much more. So abdominal distension is more in distal atresia. Signs of dehydration depending upon the degree of vomitings. Okay. Along with that, 32% of these patients would be having jaundice. Why should that be? Because the intestinal obstruction increases the enterohepatic circulation of bile, and that leads to hyperbilirubinemia and jaundice. Low-grade fever, neurological involvement manifested by irritability, lethargy, or coma. With stenosis, presentation can be delayed for weeks. Why? Because there is no actual block, it is only narrowing. So these patients will present not with actual complete acute obstruction, there will be partial bowel obstruction. Now, 10% of patients with jejunal-ileal atresia, they got cystic fibrosis and meconium ileus, so that has to be ruled out. Just a very small chart to differentiate between jejunal and ileal atresia. The gestational age and birth weight is usually low for jejunal, older for ileal, birth weight is higher for ileal atresia. Numbers, jejunal atresia could be multiple. Ileal is always solitary. Perforations are less common in jejunal, more common in ileal. The mortality rate, MR is mortality rate, MORB is morbidity rate, more in jejunal, less in ileal. Associated malformations, more in jejunal, less in ileal. So the more distal the block, the less the complications and less the problem. So here also the having morbidity and mortality is less, but the perforation are more common. Why is that? For the simple reason that the dilatation and the distension has to be huge because it's a more distal block. So that is the essential difference between jejunal and ileal atresias. The treatment is always surgical. Once you have resuscitated the patient, it has to be surgical. And the problem in atresia is the hugely dilated proximal bowel and the collapsed distal. That means the discrepancy between the diameter of the distal segment and the proximal segment. So this is very narrow. This is huge. So what do? You can do a spatula anastomosis. You can increase the opening and make it according to this opening. This is what is known as a primary dissection anastomosis with a spatula anastomosis. The second thing could be that you're trying to do a luminoplasty. That means this huge dilated limb has been converted into two. You have converted this. So you're doing a luminoplasty either by interning it, that means you put it in and you apply sutures, or you cut it from the middle, remove this whole part and narrow this down, and then you can do anastomosis. So primary proximal luminoplasty, that means you do a lumen construction with anastomosis, and in all these cases, whether you're doing this or this, always do a proximal ostomy. Why? Because in children, these anastomoses tend to give way much faster because ischemic injuries is much common in these patients. Now coming to the second one, and that is the meconium ileus. This is the second acute neonatal obstruction we're talking about, apart from atresia and stenosis, and that is meconium ileus, autosomal recessive, family history may or may not be there. The causes almost always with cystic fibrosis. That means most of these patients would be having a cystic fibrosis, and 80 to 9% would be with cystic fibrosis. 20% of cystic fibrosis patient will be having neonatal obstruction of meconium ileus. So that is the converse. Just like in a patient with gallbladder cancer, we say 90% would be associated with what? With a stone disease. But if you look at how many stone diseases make a gallbladder cancer, less than 1%, right? So that is how it works. So here also, if you have a patient with meconium ileus, be sure that 80 to 90% will be having a coexisting cystic fibrosis. But 80 to 90% cystic fibrosis do not have meconium ileus. Only 20% cystic fibrosis patient would be having a meconium ileus. And why does it happen? Because lack of pancreatic enzymes make the meconium so viscid, causing luminal obstruction, right? Also shaded with low birth weight babies. Usually, it can be a manifestation of uncomplicated meconium ileus. What does meconium ileus really mean? What are we talking about? We're talking about a thick meconium leading to blockage, luminal block of the terminal ileum, so that it presents as a luminal block. So in meconium ileus, we're looking at a luminal block because of thick viscid meconium, which the peristaltic activity of the ileum is not able to propel more distally, leading to proximal obstruction. There could be a number of complications. So one is it stops at that point and the patient presents with that. But suppose along with that, the patient may have further complications. What could be further complications? Number one, the child can also have perinatal volvulus, ischemic necrosis, intestinal atresia or perforation, and meconium peritonitis. The meconium is leaked into the peritoneum, so meconium peritonitis. So meconium ileus can either present as an uncomplicated or it can present as a complicated form. Now, when you look at meconium ileus, this is a typical picture of meconium ileus, what is known as a soap bubble sign. This is a soap bubble sign. See, it looks as if the soap has been mixed with air and water. So air mixed with meconium in the right lower abdomen, or the Neuhauser sign, is also known as a soap bubble sign. And why do you get the soap bubble? Because you have mixing of the meconium along with the air and the contrast that you have pushed in, right? Now, how does it present? Meconium ileus has to present with small bowel obstruction. Why? Because the obstruction is ileum. And what obstruction? Lumen. What causes luminal obstruction? Thick, viscid meconium pellets. So the patient presents with gross abdominal distension bilious vomiting, delayed or failure to pass meconium, all features of small bowel obstruction. So just remember, meconium ileus, child will present with small bowel obstruction. And how do you diagnose it? A plain skygram, a contrast study, or a contrast enema. What else will be seen? You will find a microcolon. See this part of the colon? Can you see this part of the colon? Absolutely collapsed. Absolutely collapsed. Why is it collapsed? Because remember, one of the most important stimulant for any bowel growth is the luminal content. If no content is reaching the colon remains a collapsed state, doesn't develop, and that is why you have a microcolon. What's going to happen in meconium ileus? The block at ileum. So nothing reaches the ascending colon, nothing reaches the transverse colon, nothing reaches the descending colon right from birth. So that part of the colon is all in a microform, so microcolon, and can also be diagnosed on the basis of a contrast enhanced CT examination. What do you do? Just to give you a broad view, either you can do a conservative with gastrographin enema, give this patient gastrographin enema. Now, gastrographin enema is gastrographin is a hygroscopic substance. That means it imbibes water. So if it's going to imbibe water, the luminal content of fluid will increase. That luminal content of fluid will make the meconium less viscid, and then the peristaltic activity will be able to propel the less viscid meconium now proximally. So in a very few percentage of cases, just giving the patient repeated gastrographin enema would suffice in these patients, right? Patient doesn't respond to that. Now what do you have? You have to go in for surgery. Now what could be the surgery? Number one, you just do a plain and simple enterotomy. You made an opening you draw a loop out, made an opening, push in a catheter, and with the catheter, you push in saline and you carry out a pellet evacuation with a temporary stoma known as the tube loop enterostomy. Why loop enterostomy? Because you have watered a loop. And why tube? Because you pushed in a tube into the proximal part and you have tried to remove the pellets from that particular part. The most accepted form of therapy is what is known as Bishop-Koop operation. Now, these are basically known as chimney enterostomies. Chimney enterostomies because this looks like a chimney. You know what a chimney is? Chimney is what is found inside the kitchen, right? So the smoke comes from here and goes out of the chimney. So here also there are two types of chimney enterostomy which can be done. In one, the proximal, that means proximal is this is coming from the stomach and this is the proximal limb, this is the distal limb. So in one, the proximal limb has been brought out as an enterostomy and the distal limb is anastomosed to the proximal limb out here, right? So here, instead of a loop, suppose if you cut it from here and you anastomose here, this will give rise to what is known as Santulli and Blanc's chimney enterostomy. The problem with this is very easy to understand. Now, with proximal limb brought out, there will be higher chances of high output stoma and associated electrolyte and fluid imbalances. While if you reverse this and do a Bishop-Koop, and where instead of the proximal limb, you have brought out the distal limb. So whatever is coming proximally, that means the gastric content, the biliary content, the pancreatic content, will not be brought out to the exterior as would be happening in the proximal enterostomy in Santulli. So here, whatever is coming here would perforce go distally. And in addition, this enterostomy would help you to liquefy and manually remove these pellets. These round ones are nothing but meconium pellets, And remember, this anastomosis should be such that it's lying 4 centimeters from the enterostomy side, whether it's this or this. So you can do a distal chimney enterostomy or you can do a proximal chimney enterostomy. And the third thing that you can do is you can do a resection anastomosis, what is known as Mikulicz resection, where instead of doing this anastomosis, you bring it out as a barrel enterostomy, right? So that is the treatment. Now coming to the last part of obstruction, and that's a large bowel obstruction. And if you classify large bowel obstruction, the definition is obstruction distal to the ileocecal wall. The types can be various. You can do it a clinical types, acute or chronic. You can do a anatomical typing, partial versus total, or you can do it physiological types, mechanical versus functional. Mechanical, that means there is either a luminal block or a mural block or extramural block. So you can have extramural, mural, and luminal. You can also have a closed loop. That means the distal block and proximal block, and in between is lying a closed loop. So you can have a closed loop block as found in volvulus, obstructed hernias, colonic block with a functioning IC wall. So the IC wall function as one block, the distal transverse colon lesion function one block. So anything lying in between these two blocks would be a closed loop. Or else you could be having a non-mechanical or a purely functional where there is no lumen, nothing wrong with the lumen, nothing wrong with the wall per se anatomically, nothing wrong outside the wall. It is only that the impulses are problematic in these patients. So that's one of the functional, right? Now coming to the large bowel obstruction, mechanical or dynamic causes, 85% of all lower bowel obstruction include volvulus. Now that is most common cause worldwide. 33% of all large bowel obstruction, especially sigmoid, are the causes. Even in India, the most common cause of large bowel obstruction is the sigmoid volvulus, as opposed to in the Western world, where the most common cause is the colorectal cancer. We don't find so much incidence of colorectal cancer as found in the Western world. So here in our country and in the Asian population, the volvulus, especially sigmoid volvulus, is the most common cause of large bowel obstruction. In the Western world, developed world, it is the colorectal cancer, which is the most common cause for large bowel obstruction. Next is the diverticulitis. So three common causes. Number one, sigmoid. Number two, CRC, colorectal cancer, and number three, diverticulitis. The other less common causes would include tuberculosis or inflammatory bowel disease. You have strictures, which could be tubercular stricture, malignant stricture, ischemic stricture, post-diverticular stricture. You could have interception, or you can have in old age pure and simple fecal impaction, where hard feculates have blocked the lumen and giving rise to large bowel obstruction. This is just a tabulated form of cause large bowel obstruction. You can go through it. This just enumerates the various causes, and last on the list are the functional causes, which we'll be just talking about in the future slide. Now, coming to the large bowel obstruction, when the patient presents with acute obstruction, he can present with chronic obstruction. Acute, chronic. Remember when we're talking about the classification, see, acute versus chronic. So now coming to the acute type. Now, when we talk about acute obstruction, signs and symptoms obviously have to be acute onset, right? And what are the symptoms which will acutely present? Severe colicky abdominal pain, distension which starts in the flanks. Remember, as opposed to small bowel where it is a periumbilical distension, here the distension is either in the flanks or localized to one of the quadrants. If it is a cecal or if it is sigmoid, in the right lower quadrant or the left lower quadrant. Late features, when the ileocecal wall becomes incompetent, only then you start having the periumbilical distension or the central distension. You will be having generalized abdominal tenderness, you'll be having nausea, regurgitant vomiting, and the latter two can also be seen very early in closed loop obstruction. So if the patient got closed loop obstruction, very early generalized abdominal distension, very early tenderness, and very early nausea and regurgitant vomiting. Closed loop obstructions, more acute onset and rapid progression and vascular compromise, leading to frank gangrene, as opposed to a non-closed loop obstruction. So that means in volvulus, you'll be having a very high chance of having an early onset of gangrene. Evidence of obstructed hernia, especially if it is left inguinal, again, very beneficial, especially when you've got a sliding hernia on the left side, gets obstructed, the sigmoid is entrapped, that again gives rise to a large bowel obstruction. Necrosis and perforation post-obstruction is more common in the cecum. So if we compare the sigmoid and the cecal volvulus, necrosis and perforation is more common on the cecum side and less common in the sigmoid, and that has to do with the Laplace law. I'm not going to go into what Laplace law says, but just so that it's mentioned out here, largest diameter is the cecum as even more than the sigmoid, so distension is more with lower pressure and will develop higher wall stress. Go and look up what Laplace law says and how it can be applied to a cecal volvulus. Investigations, hematological, increase polymorpholeukocytosis, especially the polys are raised. Biochemistry will be finding electrolytes abnormalities, raised CRP, increased lactate levels, base excess, decreased pH, all features of acute cell obstruction. Acute cell obstruction. A place diagram of the abdomen will give rise to kidney bean appearance in cecal and sigmoid volvulus. Why? Because they give rise just like a kidney bean, kidney shaped either the right iliac fossa or left iliac fossa. That's how it appears on a place diagram. If you do a contrast study with an enema or a water-soluble contrast, like for example barium or gastrographin, you will get what is known as a bird beak sign of the volvulus. Now, investigation continued. What else can you do? You can do a CECT with using an oral and an IV contrast. Why? Because you want to differentiate between the anatomical and the physiological causes. Whether you're really having a functional large bowel obstruction, you're having a mechanical large bowel obstruction, the site, what is causing it, where it is occurring, and how are the vessels doing in that particular obstruction. That whole information can be had from a CT, and that is why it is considered the gold standard of diagnosing large bowel obstruction. You can do endoscopy, in this case a colonoscopy, obviously. You can do MRI, the colonic motility in patient with inflammatory bowels disease, pseudo obstruction, and functional bowel disorders can all be diagnosed on a MRI as opposed to the other forms of diagnosis. The treatment is simple: resuscitate, and if possible, endoscopically manage. Like for example, suppose the patient has got stage 4 malignancy, you can easily put in a stent. The end of it. That is, of course, a palliative treatment, but that is a treatment in a end stage CRC, colorectal cancer, end stage luminal obstruction. Push in a stent, the lumen is re-established, the obstruction at least will be relieved. So endoscopic management can be done. Number 2, surgical. You can do a laparoscopic or an open approach. And what should you do? Number 1, distend or decompress the distended bowel. That is the first thing. And then manage the cause, whatever the cause, right? If you got a volvulus, we already talked about that last time. What you do for a volvulus. If you got CRC, we already talked about colorectal cancer. What is to be done? So I'm not going to repeat that at this point in time. Now that was the acute large bowel obstruction. Now let's come to the chronic large bowel obstruction. What are the presentation as opposed to an acute? So here it is a history extending into months and years. Chronic presentation. There it is acute within a couple of hours to 1 or 2 days only. Here it is chronic. Initial constipation is a presenting feature. Gradually increasing constipation. Flank distension is gradual. Vomitings are very, very late to appear. So the whole presentation as compared to acute large bowel obstruction is delayed, and it is gradually progressive as compared to an acute, where it is rapidly progressive and a very short duration. Okay. Now coming to the causes of large bowel, chronic large bowel obstruction. See, we're talking about chronic now. Intraluminal fecolates. Intramural, like for example, stricture, there is a partial stenosis, will give rise to chronic manifestation. Anastomotic stenosis, you can have extrinsic, metastatic, or endometriosis. So all these will give rise to a chronic large bowel obstruction. You can have a functional, again, that will give rise to chronic large bowel obstruction. For example, idiopathic megacolon, a pseudo obstruction, a Hirschsprung disease, so on and so forth. How do you diagnose it? Contrast water soluble enema, a colonoscopic examination, and a CT scan. How do you treat it? Treat the cause. The functional has to be treated colonoscopically by colonoscopic decompression. So that was the chronic large bowel obstruction. Now coming to the most important part of bowel obstruction, which we understand very least commonly, and that is the adynamic obstruction or dysmotility of the intestine. Now what is the problem with this condition? The problem with this condition is it's a very, very hugely mixed up condition. Why do you say mixed up? For the simple reason that you tend to combine a number of things into this one single definition. So how do you define adynamic obstruction? Definition is a state in which there is failure of transmission of peristaltic waves secondary to neuromuscular failure. So you're basically having a neuromuscular failure, because of which there is a failure of transmission of the peristaltic wave, right? And where is the failure? You got only 2 plexuses. One which is lying inside the muscula propria, that means the proper muscular layer, that is the Orvax plexus, and number 2 lying inside the muscular layer in the submucosa, and that is the Meissner's plexus. So there's something wrong in these plexus, because of which the transmission of neurogenic impulses is not normal or optimal. Now acute, dynamic, or chronic adynamic. So in the adynamic obstruction, again, it can present as an acute form, it can present as a chronic form. Just like in large bowel obstruction, functional, the mechanical type, it was acute or chronic. Similarly, adynamic obstruction can either be acute or it could be chronic. The acute could be of 2 types. One, what we commonly know as paralytic ileus, and number 2 is what we know as the Ogilvie's syndrome or acute colonic pseudo obstruction. The second variety is chronic adynamic obstruction, also known as chronic pseudo obstruction, which is large bowel or small bowel. Now coming to the first one, and that is adynamic obstruction, paralytic ileus versus pseudo obstruction. This is where the whole problem lies in adynamic obstruction. Why? See the first line. Several texts and articles tend to use ileus synonymously with pseudo-obstruction or refer to both of them combined as colonic ileus. But let me tell you one thing, these two conditions are definitely distinct entities. There is a tendency to confuse both of them and combine both of them as one single entity, but that's not true. That's not true. Both of them are different. So both occur in the absence of a definable mechanical pathology. That is there. There's no mechanical pathology. But ileus or pileatic ileus, as we know, it is temporary, reverses with time, and can occur both in small bowel and large bowel, as opposed to an acute pseudo-obstruction in the large bowel, which could be acute or chronic. Acute form is Ogilvie's syndrome. The differentiation with pileatic ileus, here it is limited to the colon, classically the right side of the colon. So a pileatic ileus is problem of the small bowel primarily. It doesn't mean it cannot involve the large bowel, but primarily it's a small bowel. A pseudo-obstruction is primarily, acute pseudo-obstruction, primarily large bowel, especially the ascending colon. It doesn't mean it cannot involve the small bowel, but that is very rare. And there's a marked distinction of the large bowel. So the differentiation pileatic ileus and pseudo-obstruction is a must. So what is pileatic ileus all about? If you look at the causes, it's one of the common outcomes in a postoperative patient where the bowels have not functioned even up to 72 hours. We like to call it a 72 pileatic ileus. Why do they don't function out 72 hours, up to 72 hours, or even after that? Because the sympathetic tone of the sphincters are much more. So hypersympathetic activity of the sphincters. Which sphincters are we talking about? Ileocecal junction. It's a physiological sphincter. You don't really have an anatomical sphincter there. Physiological sphincter. So that fails to relax. It's not relaxing. The whole of the proximal small bowel starts descending. So induced hypersympathetic response leading to postoperative beyond 72 hours surgical stress leading to distension of the bowel. Infection, inflammatory response mediators, like for example sepsis, peritonitis, intra-abdominal abscesses. In all these conditions, there could be release of huge inflammatory mediators giving rise to the pileatic ileus. Reflex ileus. What is reflex ileus? Patient has got a fracture of the spine or the ribs. The nerves have gone into reflex paralysis, or there has been retroperitoneal hemorrhage, or even application of plaster jacket. One of the very common. A patient had a thoracic spine injury and is put into a plaster jacket. He has pileatic ileus. Why does he have that? Because the neurogenic impulses have been ripped off or they have been obstructed. Metabolic, like for example, uremia, chronic renal failures, hypokalemia, hyponatremia, then hypo or hypermagnesium, both the conditions, more magnesium, less magnesium, you'll have pileatic ileus. Most common contributory factors to all of these could be a hypothyroidism. Drug-induced anticholinergic, opiates, calcium channel blockers, tricyclic antidepressant. In patients who got on depressants, one of the very common group of patients who come to us with chronic constipation, you take a proper history, they will almost always give you a history that taking antidepressants, a sizable population. So the drug-induced anticyclic or tricyclic antidepressants are very commonly the group of patients who are using these drugs are very commonly presenting with pileatic ileus. Vascular cause could be there, namely mesenteric ischemia. How does the pileatic ileus present? Gradually increasing distension until the peristaltic activity ceases, the pain disappears, the vomiting becomes regurgitant. So gradually increasing distension, no pain, regurgitant vomiting, presenting features of a pileatic ileus. Radiologically, what do you find? You find gas-filled loops of intestine with multiple fluid levels, and on a CECT, contrast-enhanced CT examination of the abdomen, you find prolonged ileus to rule out organic causes of and rule out sepsis. So you have to go in for a CCT examination. The treatment is simple. Do not, one sentence stands out always when you talk about pileatic ileus, and that is, do not flog a tired horse. Underline it, write it down, underline it. Do not flog a tired horse. What is a tired horse? आप घुड़सवारी कर रहे हो, दौड़ तेज नहीं रहा है, आप क्या कर रहे हो? चाबुक मारते रहते हो, मारते रहते हो, मारते रहते हो. The moment you start using the chabuk on a horse, you're using a flogging. That is not flogging. So you keep on flogging. In the initial stage, what's going to happen? The horse is going to run fast until he tires out. When he tires out, whether you flog the horse, you don't flog the horse is not going to run fast. Simple. In paralytic ileus, initially if you use stimulant, the peristaltic activity is stimulated. But if there is something causing a neurogenic block, no matter how much stimulation you carry out on the intestine, ultimately the intestine has to tire out. That's why I said, do not flog a tired horse. Okay. Similarly, in paralytic ileus, please do not try to use stimulant. So what should you do? Let it rest. Let the horse rest until he gains strength. Similarly, let the bowel rest. So what do? You put in a Ryle's tube, carry out aspiration, nasogastric aspiration. Until that time, you give this patient fluid electrolyte so that the balances are maintained, especially as regards the potassium, sodium, and calcium, because the dearth of all three, along with magnesium, will give rise to prolongation of paralytic ileus. So that has to be done, right? Now, once you've done all this and you still find that now the patient is not responding even after 48 to 72 hours of a treatment, then you will use prokinetics in the form of domperidone, erythromycin, or levosulfuride, which can partially stimulate the neurogenic activity of the bowel, right? Now, adynamic obstruction, acute pseudo obstruction. So this was paralytic ileus. Now, the condition to be confused with paralytic ileus is a acute pseudo obstruction of the colonic type. Remember, we said that these are the two conditions always mixed up. This is also known as Ogilvie's syndrome. So the Ogilvie syndrome, the differential diagnosis is paralytic ileus. The differential diagnosis of paralytic ileus is Ogilvie syndrome, not chronic pseudo obstruction. It is acute pseudo obstruction, which is colonic, right? So primarily involves the right colon and the transverse colon. I just now told you that. Rare, 100 in 1 lakh admissions. Most commonly, where is it seen? Most commonly seen in elderly bedridden patients with serious extraintestinal illnesses. Like, for example, the patient had trauma, the patient has got severe diabetic ketoacidosis, the patient is an ICU patient has a lot of drugs. So these are the patients, excuse me, these are the patients where you're looking at a scenario which is ripe for the onset of a Ogilvie syndrome, right? So you can have sepsis, electrolyte discrepancy may also contribute to this condition. Clinical features: acute large bowel obstruction, pain, flank abdominal distension, and vomiting, which is not there in paralytic ileus. It will be there in acute pseudo obstruction. Systemic toxicity and renal tenderness. If there is impending cecal perforation, will not be there in paralytic ileus, would be there in acute colonic pseudo obstruction or Ogilvie syndrome. And when you suspect the patient is going to have a cecal perforation, when you find that the transverse diameter of the dilated cecum is more than 14 centimeters, be sure that this cecum is going to perforate, right? The diagnosis of acute pseudo obstruction or Ogilvie syndrome, the diagnosis: leukocytosis. On X-ray, gaseous colonic distension up to the rectum, as opposed to paralytic ileus, where it is primarily small bowel. Marked cecal distension, I just now told you. When do you call it huge? Beyond 9. When you call it critical? More than 14. I just now told you that the time when a perforation can occur. Barium enema, single contrast water soluble enema helps. CECT is again the gold standard. A colonoscopy helps in two ways. It becomes both therapeutic and diagnostic. It can lead to decompression. The differential diagnosis, I just have told you, paralytic ileus. Then you got toxic megacolon and mechanical obstruction are all differential diagnoses, right? The treatment of an acute pseudo obstruction as opposed to paralytic ileus. What is the treatment of paralytic ileus? I just now told you: rest to the bowel and rest to the bowel and rest to the bowel, and give support to the patient. If that doesn't work out, then use prokinetics. Here, what is the treatment? Again, conservative, but here neostigmine is to be used early in a 1 milligram IV dose stat. You can repeat a second dose in a few minutes. Remember, neostigmine, whenever giving neostigmine, always under ECG control and atropine in reserve. But then neostigmine is to be used only if there is no specific identifiable cause. If there is an identifiable cause for pseudo obstruction, a colonic type, always treat that identifiable cause, right? The second alternative that you have for treating is colonoscopic. and best is just doing a colonoscopy decompression, especially where the neostomy has not worked. You put in a colonoscope, the whole thing, the distension goes away. Why? Because a huge output of gaseous content from the colon. If you find that you remove the colonoscope and if you still have a recurrence, just leave a flatus tube behind. So decompression or decompression with simultaneous placement of a flatus tube, which ensures permanent decompression for 24 hours or 48 hours, especially if you find that this patient has had a recurrent pseudo-obstruction of colonic type in the acute form. A patient who has got, even after colonoscopy doesn't respond, then you've got an option of putting a tube in the C cup. Do a tube cecostomy, right? Failure of unavailable colonoscopy, you can do a tube cecostomy. Or else if you find that this patient's got this kind of obstruction recurrent for a long period of time, in these cases, you have to go in for excision, and that is a subtotal colectomy with ileorectal anastomosis. What does subtotal colectomy mean? That means I am removing everything from the ileocecal wall up to the sigmoid. I remove everything. What do I have left behind? The ileum, distally rectum. So I do a ileorectal anastomosis. But the very fact that you remove the whole of the colon and you're anastomosing the ileum to the rectum basically means high morbidity and high mortality. Coming to the last one, and that is the chronic pseudo-obstruction, which involves both the small and the large bowel. Remember, acute pseudo-obstruction, only the large bowel. Paralytic ileus, only the small bowel. Chronic pseudo-obstruction, small and large bowel. Again, dysmotility here, both small and large bowel, because of the neurogenic impulses, the motor impulses from the orbex and the business plexus, manifests as recurrent small bowel obstruction. That is very, very important. Acute pseudo-obstruction, primarily colonic obstruction. A chronic pseudo-obstruction, primarily a small bowel manifestation with minimal large bowel manifestation. Causes, again, primary are because of familial visceral myopathy, that there is a problem with intestinal muscles. Visceral myopathy means visceral muscle, or collagen vascular diseases, visceral myopathy, or neuropathy as a secondary occurrence in collagen disorders. Diagnosis, you have to rule out mechanical causes, only then you can diagnose a chronic pseudo-obstruction. But when will you call it chronic as opposed to Ogilvie syndrome? When it has been there for months on end, or has been progressive as a gradual or recurrent small bowel obstruction over a period of months. Metoclopramide or erythromycin, which are prokinetic agents, may be helpful in these conditions. I think that finishes the complete chapter of intestinal obstruction. And from next time, I think we'll talk about a new chapter. If you have any questions, you can get back to me. And this is always there. So you can, this lecture will be uploaded, I think, by tonight or tomorrow morning. And those who want to revisit this, they can do so. Thank you for your time.